Hello everybody, can you hear me? It's everything okay. Good. So of course I would like to thank the organizing committee for the invitation, and especially Dr. Anna Varga for coordinating and supporting our travel and stay here. Thank you very much for your warm hospitality. It is really a great pleasure to be here and to give this talk with my colleague Judith Bopp. So I'm also particularly glad for the frame of this year's talk, Crises and Methods, because it raises issues that are key to scholarly research in the environmental humanities. In fact, despite the differences in the topic and in the fields we study, we all live and research in an age of crisis. Socioecological crisis, crisis in representation, and ultimately a global crisis in sense-making, which is an epistemological crisis, a crisis that affects the way in which we understand and make sense of the world we study and in which we live. This crisis, of course, impacts on our life and our work, but at the same time they offer potential for imagining new socioecological and political configurations, for developing new relational paradigms and narratives, and for generating alternative ways of exploring and knowing. Think, for example, of the Anthropocene. So this idea was rejected in 2024 by the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which is the international scientific body in charge of measuring stratigraphy and verifying the rightfulness of geological chronology. So this concept persists beyond this rejection, and it is commonly used as a synonym for the current socioecological crisis, emphasizing the negative impact of humans on Earth. As you see, this is a classical image. In social sciences and environmental humanities, we continue to use this term, well aware of the fact that this concept overlooks political and economic imbalances. However, we still engage with the Anthropocene, with this concept, not as a synonym for socioecological crisis, but because of the paradox it raises. A paradox aptly summarized by anthropologist Andrew Whitehouse when he observes that the Anthropocene's usefulness as a concept lies in its ambiguities, which emphasize the anxieties and possibilities that might be imagined in human-driven global systems, and in its power to signal both the interconnectedness of human and non-human lives and the potential for their destruction and silencing. So this means that despite its problems, the Anthropocene has generative potential, because it unveils the interconnectedness of social, geological, and climatological regimes, triggering what Gisli Palsson and Heather Swanson called a new mode of scholarship, one that stays with the trouble, to use the famous expression by Donna Haraway. So this is a beautiful article on the environmental humanities by Palsson and Heather Swanson, where they argue about this mode of scholarship. So the Anthropocene, thence, may have failed as a geological epoch, but has become a mode of scholarship that, by unveiling the interconnectedness of the human and other than human components of the environment, has challenged the modern understanding of nature as separated from society. However, this mode of scholarship has a longer history that emerged from a period of environmental, social, and epistemological uncertainty that has brought forth critical thinking. And this, of course, has shaped the research in environmental humanities, suggesting to think of ways of life instead of species, of environments as emergent relational processes rather than stages where life is contained, and challenging the very concept of individual as a bounded, defined, self-contained entity, suggesting instead ideas of entangled modes of existence and of knots, perpetually raveling and unraveling within an unbounded matrix of relations. Of course, these are just few references that I find relevant for my work, but there is a lot of literature, as you know, about these issues. So in suggesting these different ways of thinking, this relational approach has ultimately contributed to challenge the Cartesian modernist paradigm because it undermines the dualism on which such a paradigm rests: body and mind, nature and culture, subject and object. And this aspect is critical because it affects one of the pillars on which scholarly work has built its authority over the last 3 centuries, which is the idea of objectivity. I'm stating the obvious here, maybe. So scientific objectivity is based on the assumption that there is a line that divides the subject, the scholar, from what or who the scholar researches, which becomes an object of research. Such an understanding results in a process of detachment, objectification, and reification that makes it possible to transform our experiences of learning and the stories from which these experiences emerge into data that can be represented, discussed, and shared. And this process of simplification, or purification if you like, often results in transforming environments into stages where life is contained, places into geographical coordinates, landscapes into objects of contemplation, and socioecological relations into networks of bounded entities set over against the world. So when we think of crises and methods, we should be aware of all this complexity that requires an effort in finding new modes for implementing our research. Of course, there are many different approaches that address this complexity in many different ways. What I want to share with you today is my own approach that I have been developing over the last decade. And this approach is loosely inspired by the idea of deep mapping that I practice in my research on wetlands and in teaching, leading workshop in different contexts. So, to me, deep mapping is a creative approach, a set of strategies, if you like, that helps to grasp and be aware of complexity by triggering a way of knowing that emerges through a particular sensibility, an education of attention, to use Tim Ingold's expression, that is poetic and highly subjective. And I want to dwell a little bit on these 2 terms. So, when I use these terms, I refer particularly to a very beautiful little book written by German biologist and philosopher Andreas Weber, entitled Enlightenment Towards a Poetics for the Anthropocene, and published by MIT Press in 2019, so a very scientific academic press. So when I say subjective, I do not mean something idiosyncratic or purely individual. I refer to what Andreas Weber calls collective subjectivity, a form of subjectivity that extends across the environment and that includes individual and communities of different species. It is an idea of subjectivity based on the assumption that our life emerges in a commons even before we perceive our individuality. Our subjectivity is already intersubjectivity. Self is self through other. This is what Weber writes. And of course, here he draws on a rich tradition of relational thinking that have addressed these problems. I'm thinking particularly of Tim Ingold. You may know Tim Ingold is a British anthropologist. And in his work, The Perception of the Environment, a book from 2000, he argued that every living being is a singular locus of creative growth within a continually unfolding field of relationships. So it is a singular locus, but it is very much entangled in a field of relations that are ongoing. So when I speak of a subjective approach, I'm thinking of this kind of subjectivity, which is inherently relational, ecological, and collective. A subjectivity that always combines organism and the environment, individuals and communities in a unified whole. In this sense, it is a subjectivity that has nothing to do with the Cartesian modernist idea of subjectivity as a property, of a bounded entity. Likewise, when I use the term poetic, I do not refer to a literary dimension opposed to a scientific one. Rather, I use the term poetic to emphasize that the world is not only weight, volume, and surface to be measured. The world, says Andreas Weber, is weight and volume, and it is inwardness. And this inwardness is felt through subjective and embodied experience and can be grasped through an education of attention that generates a particular sensibility towards the aliveness and expressiveness of the world, to its meaning beyond data and before being turned into data. And the poetic knowledge that emerges from this sensibility proceeds not by acquiring information to be used as missing pieces to complete a jigsaw or to fill a gap. Now we have this expression that our work, our research want to fill a gap. So it doesn't proceed like that. It rather proceeds through speculative insights by following clues that by means of imagination are generative of further questions to be explored. Now, I want to dwell a little bit more on deep mapping. So my understanding of deep mapping draws particularly on the ideas of open deep mapping developed by Ian Biggs, who is a British scholar and pioneer of deep mapping. And Ian Biggs describes this approach as a sort of a saying, an act of personal witness, that it's about interweaving many disparate, tensioned strands of experience, genres of writing, knowledge positions, and narrative perspectives, so as to produce a richer, more resonant patterning of meaning while retaining the pleasures of discrete threads within the larger whole. So this integrated approach, or methodological pluralism, if you prefer, which in my case includes archival research, participant observation, landscape explorations, interviews, and use of photography, videos, and sound recording, generates a deep intimacy with places and with the living beings that inhabit them. This intimacy generates knowledge about place. Most importantly, though, it opens up to forms of wonder and fascination that may trigger and stimulate what Tim Ingold calls a correspondence with place and its inhabitants. Following Tim Ingold's argument, I argue that this intimacy precipitates into a sort of wisdom that grows in place and that lies in attending to things. This wisdom is not extractive. It does not seek to control or represent the world from a distance. Instead, it emerges from sustained presence, from patient observation, from allowing ourselves to be taught by the places we study. This sort of wisdom, I think, is deep. It is important to clarify that the adjective deep here does not refer to the idea of producing knowledge that is deep in contrast with shallow kind of knowledge. In my understanding, deep refers to the attitude and engagement involved in this process of knowing. It is an engagement that generates and moves within a particular epistemological framework that Ian Biggs describes, drawing on feminist scholar Ruth Behar, as situated in a space between, which is at once the inscription of a self and the description of an object, open-ended in nature and able to disaggregate the boundaries between self and other. So deep mapping, as I understand it, requires us to be in this space between. It involves what bell hooks defines a politics of location, which is critical for both unveiling traces of hope in places characterized by loss and crisis, and at the same time for generating novel narratives beyond hegemonic accounts framed within either environmental conservation or environmental degradation discourses. So when we speak about crisis, especially socioecological crisis, our discourse always fell between these two lines of thinking, no? Environmental conservation or environmental degradation. Deep mapping to me is precisely a form of resistance to these hegemonic accounts, a way to expresses narratives that does not simplify or obscure socioecological relations. The approach that I'm presenting also owes much to Nuno Sacramento, a deep mapper and director at Peacock Visual Arts in Aberdeen, Scotland, who describes deep mapping in this way. Deep mapping is an investigation of a site of your choice and the discovery of what is often hidden behind the official, sanctioned, and authorized. Deep mapping is about doing things differently from ordinary cartography, shifting away from large expanses of territory. Rather, it is about the small, the subjective, the embodied, the thick, and the porous. So, deep mapping is about place, is about subjectivity. It is about the body as a locus of experience, movement through space, and the accumulation of sensory, emotional, and memory traces that shape how we know a place. In this way, deep mapping challenges objective and distanced representation, proposing instead a form of knowledge that is relational, situated, humble, and alive. A knowledge that grows from being in between rather than aside, in front, or above. What I like of this particular definition is also its openness. There are no instruction booklets nor structured methodologies for the mapping. Any practitioner has its own methods and strategies or may develop ones according to specific needs. And this openness is important because it's what allows deep mapping to resist becoming another form of simplification, another way of turning the world into data. Now, I want to give you a few examples of how I implemented this practice, starting from the very first experiment I did in 2016 in Aberdeen, Scotland, when with my partner, who is an illustrator, we started exploring an urban park named Seaton Park. And we were inspired by phenomenology and particularly by Edward Case's idea that places not only are, they happen. And it is because they happen that they lend themselves so well to narration, whether as history or as a story. This is Edward Case. So this was a fairly long and complex process that involved literary and historical research and resulted in a beautiful screen-printed maps that we created as a contribution to the ERC project Knowing from the Inside, led at the time by Tim Ingold at Aberdeen University. Just to give you a sense of this project, of this map, I want to read a little bit the cartouche that we wrote that reads, "When walking in Seaton Park, our imagination has followed the flow of water. Sometimes it floated, at other times it sank in the murky and stagnant ponds of the park. Water has soaked our thoughts as well as the air, the soil, the trees, and the other creatures inhabiting the park. This is a sentimental and imaginative map of water in Seaton Park. It serves as a catalyst for imaginative wanderings, memories, history, and stories. It does not map static surfaces. It rather maps the depth of thought and imagination, as well as the fluid consistency of water. It maps the invisible landscape shaped by water in our imagination. It is a distillation of our experience and an invitation to experience the park. It shows how we feel in a certain place and the relations we have with it. So the point of this experiment was to restore the role of imagination, memory, stories, and the senses into the cartographic inscription beyond scale and representation. It started as a very individual research, but then it had a participatory dimension. The map initially was equipped with an app of augmented reality that could be used by everybody to upload materials and to explore the map with their smartphones. And the idea was precisely to trigger a participative and informal process of mapping, so to emphasize that the actual object, the map, was nothing but the product of an ongoing process of knowing. And one of the points of the experiment was also to find ways for exploring places in a rigorous manner, but beyond the constraints of academic protocols, and also find ways to convey the knowledge emerging from this process beyond the academia. So this is the back of the map. Apart from making these and other artifacts, I also experimented with other tools, making digital maps. I also use deep mapping in educational context, taking inspiration from the etymology of the term education, recently emphasized by Tim Ingold as ex ducere, meaning leading out, being exposed to uncertainty instead of being filled in with information, as in the common understanding of education. And so I started the leading workshop in different contexts. The last experiment I did was at the University of Catania in 2024 with the students of the PhD program in social and political sciences, where I used deep mapping as a way to question and reflect over objectivity in social research. I suggested the students to focus on specific things such as shadow, fear, care, and silence, and see what happens when looking for traces of these things in an urban context, such as Catania in Sicily in July. And we tried to create a map of these things, and the outcome was a map a child could do in 5 minutes. But we did it in 2 days of discussions and explorations. It required a lot of effort, but it helped us to think about objectivity, about disciplinary boundaries, and about the potential of academic education in raising questions rather than offering solutions, in generating speculative rather than instrumental knowledge. I also experimented with broader audience in Munich, where a few years ago with Dr. Anna Barks from the Polish Academy of Science, we organized a public workshop of deep mapping along the Isar River in Munich with the support of the Rachel Carson Center. So we prepared a booklet with some maps and quotes about the Isar, about rivers in general, and about deep mapping, and distributed this booklet to the participants. And following the suggestions raised by the booklet, we wandered along the river, alone and in group, for a few hours. At the end of this exploration of a very short tract of the river, we gathered together and discussed our findings, thinking about possible maps. Maps of bottle caps, maps of noises and smell, maps of objects left by people, maps of sediments and objects transported by the river, maps of birds' nests and maps of trees, maps of memories and missed opportunities. So we realized that many different things could be mapped in many different ways that are neglected in conventional scientific maps, but that nevertheless tell us a lot about place and the relations we have with it. In the end, what emerged was a completely different understanding of what a river is. Not a linear object as appears in conventional maps, but an unmappable and lively nexus of unfolding stories and relations. So what was very clear to us was the plurality of voices, languages, and understandings that could hardly fit into one map, into one representation. I found this approach very interesting and refreshing from an anthropological perspective because it echoes alternative ways of knowing places. I'm thinking, for example, of Aboriginal people in Australia for whom the land emerges along stories. To tell those stories means to map the land, and to map the land means to tell those stories. Here there is a beautiful quote from Aboriginal scholar Jill Milroy, who writes, "It is not people who are the best storytellers. The birds, the animals, the trees, the rocks, and the land, our mother, have the most important stories to tell us. These stories exist in place, and by mapping this story system, we fundamentally alter the way in which we can know country." This idea of altering the way we know places resonates with my dissatisfaction with conventional anthropological methods. So I'm developing my own method to see places in a different way by paying attention to the more than human voices that Milroy describes and using the poetic and subjective sensibility that I described. I found this approach particularly helpful in the anthropological and historical research on wetlands that I have conducted over the last 15 years. As you know, wetlands are critical for maintaining life on Earth, and yet they have been the most endangered ecosystem on Earth. Now, scientific and quantitative approaches have done much to raise awareness about wetlands, to discover how they function and why they are so important. Nevertheless, we are constantly losing wetlands everywhere. Of course, this has to do with processes of capital expansion, pressure developments, and climate change. But I would argue that part of the responsibility is also shared by current scientific approaches that are sometimes complicit in transforming the natural world into resources to be counted and accounted for, and that often overlook everything that escapes measurement, such as the intimate relations that connect inhabitants with their environment. And here there are just few pictures from my field sites. From the historical perspective too, these ecosystems, wetlands, have been neglected, especially in the Mediterranean, because historians paid much more attention to other more productive environments, So wetlands are important in our discourse because they epitomize the crisis that I mentioned, the socioecological crisis as they are threatened environments, and the crisis of hegemonic paradigms because their ambiguous nature, neither dry land nor open water, that does not fit the rationalizing mentality of modern states. For this reason, in fact, in the last 2 centuries, wetlands have undergone processes of drainage and then reclamation, especially in Europe and the global north, because they are somehow non-rational environments in modernist and reductionist economic terms. So this means that we need to find other ways, maybe other words, to address and to question this environment. I want to give you a little example with these photos that I took to explore the long and flat horizon of salt marshland in the Camargue, France, and the Oristano Gulf in Sardinia. These images tell us something about those particular landscapes and about the beings who inhabit those landscapes. No? They are flat wasteland, we can say. But the thing this picture tells us, I think, is something that we can feel, but that can hardly be measured or expressed in words somehow. So these images are important to me because they urge me to find other questions, other words, other ways to explore and describe these environments. Another example regards the Simeto River in eastern Sicily, where I've started doing research in 2024. So this is the river with the largest hydrographic basin in Sicily and one of the most degraded in the island. Like many other rivers in the second half of the 20th century, the Simeto River underwent a violent process of infrastructuring aimed at supporting intensive agriculture and hydropower plants. And this process turned the river into a water conduit. It destroyed riparian marshlands and interrupted almost completely the relationships that historically tied the river and the surrounding marshlands with the people living in the river valley. So it is a river that, like many other rivers and wet landscapes, has been completely forgotten. And here it's critical to understand what we mean with crisis. Now, the crisis is a wound. It is a cut that disconnects the past from the present and the present from the future. It is an interruption that makes it hard to trace connections, to establish relations. This is what a crisis is. And indeed, it was very challenging to me to begin a conversation with this river, with this landscape. It required time to learn how to look behind and beyond its degradation. It demanded attention, care, and exposure. I have begun this process of learning by reading about the history of the area and conducting extensive documentary research in local archives with the idea of understanding the historical and political causes that led to ecological degradation. I brought to life this historical material by imagining that just a few kilometers downhill from where I was living, that tract of the Simeto, now entombed in high artificial banks and fed by unprocessed wastewater, used to run freely, creating waterfalls described by past travelers as iridescent canvas, and creating meanders where local people used to fish, cultivate rice, and graze livestock until a century ago and less. I performed such an imagination during my daily rounds to the river. When walking amongst intensive plantations of oranges, I envisioned a much more diversified agricultural landscape with olive trees, rice paddies, and grape vines eradicated at the beginning of the last century because of phylloxera. Such a process of imagination does not imply the imposition of a fantastical image over a pre-existing landscape. It rather involves a precise and situated knowledge that enables to stay with the crisis and make sense of it, while bridging the cut that the crisis created. So it is an ecological imagination that enables to recollect what geographer Dorian Massey calls the simultaneity of stories so far, the present and past forms of this landscape, of this river and its surrounding, within the wider history and ecology of Mediterranean wetlands, impacted throughout the 20th century by radical projects of transformation and modernization that ultimately destroyed these environments. I triggered this ecological imagination as a form of situated knowledge and understanding that implied an education of attention. I cultivated attention by using my photo camera and a sound recorder as means to attend to the landscape as a site of relational encounters between human and other than human creatures. Such an attention, deepened with time, unveiled unexpected perspectives for understanding the environment and the socio-ecological relations from which this environment emerge. This approach was critical to me for discovering that the river and the valley are alive despite degradation. in the vegetation colonizing the artificial banks, in the birds that still inhabit the river, in the few people who still engage with the river, for example, for grazing livestock. Scientific approaches, both in social and natural sciences, could certainly document these presences, but they can't really feel their significance as expressions of life's stubborn persistence, as threads that connect the past and the present of this particular landscape. For example, while doing fieldwork in the river valley, I've been intrigued by the water management practices implemented in the small farm I was living in. It consists of a ditch and a pond excavated by hand that serve to keep the land wet. In that part of Sicily, which is affected by severe drought, especially in summer, this simple system of irrigation created a very interesting microhabitat that I have explored with an impermeable camera, experimenting the space between that I mentioned before. Of course, this does not have any scientific value. It is a poetic and subjective approach that nevertheless allows to observe and experience the landscape from a different perspective. And it pushed me to find new words and narratives to question and to describe this particular place. In the same area, and maybe this doesn't work very well, the sound, I've also experimented with recording environmental sounds. Here you can hear the sound of cowbells from grazing cattle, which are not in a pristine pasture in the Alps, but along the Simeto, one of the most degraded rivers in Sicily. And this sound, I think, tells a lot of that particular place and of the socioecological relations that make that place. Now, I don't want to enter into the details of this particular case study here. The point is just to give you a sense of how this subjective and poetic approach may work to develop a deep intimacy with places and with the living beings that inhabit them. So, in my understanding, deep mapping is precisely an attempt to develop such an intimacy, a robust sense of place, and to explore the things that are often overlooked by hegemonic accounts or by purely scientific, quantitative, and often reductionist approaches. The point is not to replace scientific knowledge, but to complement it with forms of attention that, by emphasizing subjective experience and poetic dimension, may help us to grasp the aliveness of place and the complexity of our entanglement with the more than human world. This education of attention opens pathways that are essential for developing the methodological pluralism needed to address the crisis we face. I'm concluding here. So the question ultimately is how we work with the crisis I outlined at the beginning of this talk. The socioecological crisis, the crisis in Cartesian rationalism, the crisis in representation, and the epistemological crisis. The approach I've described is not a solution to this crisis, but rather a way of inhabiting and staying with them, of allowing them to teach us. What emerges from the experiments I've described is that methods themselves must become more humble, more porous, more willing to be undone by what they encounter. The crises we face demand not epistemological certainty, but epistemological courage to privilege processes over outcomes and knowing over knowledge. Accordingly, the methods we use should acknowledge that these processes always involve a specific situatedness and our entanglement with what we study. So the approach that I'm suggesting experiments with this awareness. It puts it in practice, emphasizing that the crisis we face cannot be addressed only through objective methods that transform the complexity of living relations into data. We need a fundamental reorientation, what I call a poetic and subjective sensibility, by which we can capture, understand, and describe the aliveness of the world, the simultaneities of stories and the plurality of voices that make place. Thank you.